She woke up in complete darkness. Her breath turned to frost. Her husband thought she'd never see the light again. But after 5 days in a freezer, she did the unthinkable. Imagine waking up trapped in a box so cold that every breath burns your lungs. The walls are metal, the space barely fits your body, and the only sound is your heart pounding against your ribs. This is the story of Margaret Chen, a 34-year-old nurse from Tampa, Florida, who found herself in the most impossible situation imaginable. Her own husband had locked her inside their garage freezer, thinking she would never escape. But Margaret wasn't just fighting for her life, she was fighting against time, against the cold, and against the man who was supposed to love her most. How did she survive the impossible? How does someone endure 5 days in sub-zero temperatures with nothing but willpower and the clothes on her back? And what shocking discovery would turn this entire case upside down? Tonight, we uncover a story of betrayal so deep and survival so extraordinary that it will leave you questioning everything you think you know about the human spirit. Tonight, we uncover the story that shook Florida and left investigators struggling to believe what they were seeing. This isn't just another domestic violence case. This isn't just another survival story. This is something far more complex, far more disturbing, and far more inspiring than anyone could have imagined. Why would David Chen, a respected insurance agent with no criminal record, suddenly decide to lock his wife of 8 years inside a freezer? What did Margaret do during those 5 agonizing days that kept her alive when medical experts say she should have died within hours? And what shocking twist in the investigation revealed a truth that nobody saw coming? Not the police, not the prosecutors, and definitely not David himself? These questions haunted Tampa Bay for months. They divided families, sparked heated debates on social media, and forced an entire community to confront uncomfortable truths about the people they thought they knew. But before we explore those answers, before we examine the evidence that changed everything, we need to understand who Margaret and David Chen really were. Welcome to Silent Witness, True Crime Stories. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe, and also download your free ebook by clicking the link in the pinned comment. Margaret Chen seemed to have it all figured out. At 34, she was working as a pediatric nurse at Tampa General Hospital, known for her gentle bedside manner and her ability to calm even the most frightened children. Her colleagues described her as the kind of person who would stay late to read bedtime stories to patients, who remembered every child's name, and who somehow always knew exactly what to say to worried parents. She had dreams of opening her own pediatric practice someday, maybe starting a family, maybe traveling to places she'd only seen in magazines. Margaret met David at a coffee shop near the hospital in 2014. He was there reviewing insurance claims. She was grabbing her usual vanilla latte before her night shift. David was charming in that quiet, dependable way. He wasn't flashy or overly romantic, but he was steady. He remembered her coffee order after their second date. He brought her soup when she caught the flu. He talked about wanting a simple life, a nice house, maybe a dog, weekend barbecues with friends. To Margaret, who had grown up in a chaotic household with divorced parents, David's stability felt like a gift. They married in 2016 in a small ceremony at Bayshore Boulevard. Margaret's best friend Sarah later told investigators that Margaret seemed genuinely happy that day, though she noticed David seemed tense during the reception. He kept checking his phone, Sarah remembered. Even during their first dance, I saw him glance at it over Margaret's shoulder. But at the time, Sarah assumed it was work stress. David had recently been promoted to senior claims adjuster, handling more complex cases, dealing with difficult clients. The first few years of marriage appeared normal from the outside. They bought a modest 3-bedroom house in Westchase, complete with a 2-car garage and a small backyard where Margaret planted tomatoes and herbs. David would grill on weekends while Margaret worked in her garden. They seemed like any other suburban couple navigating their 30s, building a life together one small decision at a time. But friends began noticing changes in 2019. Margaret started declining invitations to dinner parties and girls' nights out. When she did attend social gatherings, David would text her constantly, asking when she'd be home, who she was talking to, what they were discussing. Margaret would excuse herself to respond immediately, her fingers flying across her phone screen with what looked like practiced urgency. Sarah confronted her about it once, asking if everything was okay at home. Margaret's response was telling, "David just worries about me. He works in insurance. He knows how dangerous the world can be." The worrying escalated to control gradually, almost imperceptibly. David started picking Margaret up from work, saying it wasn't safe for her to drive alone at night. He convinced her to share the location on her phone with him, for safety reasons. He began questioning her about every patient interaction, every conversation with colleagues, every moment of her day that he wasn't directly witnessing. Margaret's co-workers noticed she seemed more tired, more distracted, less likely to join them for lunch or after-work drinks. David's own behavior was becoming more erratic, though he hid it well from most people. His work performance began suffering as he became obsessed with monitoring Margaret's activities. He installed security cameras around their house, ostensibly for protection, but the cameras were positioned to monitor the driveway, the front door, and the garage, all places where he could track Margaret's comings and goings. Neighbors occasionally heard raised voices from the Chen house, but never anything that seemed serious enough to call police. The financial stress was mounting too. David had made some poor investment decisions, losing a significant portion of their savings in cryptocurrency that crashed in early 2021. He hid this from Margaret initially, but maintaining their lifestyle while hemorrhaging money created additional pressure. He began working longer hours, taking on more clients, but his distracted state meant he was making mistakes that cost him commissions and bonuses. By the summer of 2021, Margaret was telling her closest friends that she was considering marriage counseling. She had found some of David's financial documents and discovered they were much deeper in debt than she'd realized. She was also growing uncomfortable with his increasingly possessive behavior, though she still defended him to others. "He's just going through a rough patch," she would say. "Work is stressing him out." And then, on a humid Tuesday evening in August 2021, David brought home a brand new chest freezer. Margaret was surprised by the purchase. They already had a refrigerator with a freezer compartment that was perfectly adequate for their needs as a couple with no children. When she asked David about it, he explained that he'd found a great deal at a liquidation sale, that it would be useful for buying meat in bulk, that it was an investment in their future. The freezer was large, 7 feet long and 3 feet deep, big enough to hold several hundred pounds of food. David installed it in their garage, plugged it into a heavy-duty outlet, and tested it thoroughly to make sure it was working properly. What Margaret didn't know was that David had been planning this purchase for weeks. He had researched different models, read reviews about temperature consistency and lock mechanisms, and specifically chosen a model with a heavy lid and a latch that could only be opened from the outside. He had prepared detailed explanations for why they needed it, anticipated Margaret's questions, and rehearsed his responses until they sounded natural and reasonable. Over the next few weeks, David filled the freezer with frozen vegetables, bulk chicken, and ice cream. He showed Margaret how to organize everything efficiently, where to find what she needed, how to properly close the lid to maintain the temperature. He seemed proud of his purchase, frequently mentioning how much money they were saving by buying in bulk, how organized their meal planning had become. But Margaret noticed something odd. Despite David's enthusiasm for the freezer, he never seemed to actually eat any of the food stored inside it. When she suggested using the frozen chicken for dinner, he would suggest ordering takeout instead. When she reached for the frozen vegetables, he would offer to pick up fresh ones from the store. It was as if the freezer was meant to be full, but never actually used. On the evening of October 15, 2021, Margaret came home from her shift at the hospital exhausted and looking forward to a quiet night at home. David had been unusually attentive that week, bringing her coffee in the morning, texting sweet messages throughout the day, suggesting they spend a romantic evening together. He had prepared her favorite pasta dish and opened a bottle of wine they'd been saving for a special occasion. They ate dinner by candlelight, talking about plans for their upcoming anniversary and a vacation they were considering. After dinner, David suggested they organize the garage, something they'd been putting off for months. Margaret was tired, but David insisted it would only take an hour, and then they could relax and watch a movie. They spent about 30 minutes rearranging tools and holiday decorations, working companionably together in a way that reminded Margaret of their early dating days. She was actually enjoying the time together, feeling optimistic about their relationship for the first time in months. Then David asked her to help him with something in the freezer. He said he needed to rearrange the contents to fit some additional items he'd purchased. Margaret opened the heavy lid and leaned over to help him move some packages around. The cold air hit her face, carrying that distinctive smell of freezer ice and frozen food. She was focused on organizing the contents, trying to maximize the space, when she felt David's hands on her back. What happened next unfolded in a matter of seconds, but those seconds would replay in Margaret's mind for the rest of her life. David's gentle push became forceful, then violent. Before Margaret could process what was happening, she found herself tumbling headfirst into the freezer, packages of frozen food scattering around her as her body crashed into the metal bottom. The impact knocked the wind out of her, leaving her gasping and disoriented in the suddenly confined space. "David, what are you doing?" she gasped, trying to push herself up. The freezer was deeper than she'd realized, and in her fallen position, she couldn't immediately find leverage to climb out. Frozen packages were digging into her ribs and back, and the cold was already seeping through her thin t-shirt. She looked up at her husband's face, expecting to see concern or an apology for what must have been an accident. Instead, she saw something that chilled her more than the freezer itself. David's expression was calm, almost serene. He was looking down at her not with horror or remorse, but with what appeared to be satisfaction. His eyes met hers for a long moment, and in that moment, Margaret understood that this was no accident. The realization hit her like a physical blow, stealing what little breath she had managed to catch. "I'm sorry, Margaret," David said quietly, his voice steady and controlled. "I really am sorry it has to be this way." His tone was the same one he used when discussing insurance claims, matter-of-fact and professional. "But I can't let you leave me. I can't let you take everything away from me." Margaret tried to scramble to her feet, but the freezer's walls were slippery with condensation, and the frozen packages shifted beneath her, making it impossible to find stable footing. "David, please," she said, her voice rising in panic. "I don't understand what you're talking about. Help me out of here. This isn't funny." But David was already reaching for the freezer lid. Margaret saw it coming and tried to grab the edge, but her hands were already starting to feel numb from the cold, and she couldn't get a solid grip on the smooth metal rim. The heavy lid began to close, and Margaret's world started shrinking into darkness. "David, no!" she screamed, pushing up against the lid with all her strength. For a moment, it seemed like she might be able to keep it open, but David's leverage from above was too strong. "Please don't do this. Whatever's wrong, we can fix it. We can talk about it." "It's too late for talking," David replied, his voice already sounding distant as the lid continued to close. "You were going to leave me anyway. I found the divorce papers on your laptop. I know about the lawyer you contacted. I know about the bank account you opened." Margaret's heart stopped. She had been researching divorce attorneys and had started the process of protecting her assets, but she thought she'd been careful about covering her digital tracks. She hadn't even made a final decision yet. She was just exploring her options, trying to understand what a separation might look like. But David's surveillance had apparently been more thorough than she'd realized. The lid was almost closed now, with just a few inches of gap remaining. Margaret could see David's silhouette against the garage light, and she made one desperate attempt to reach up and grab his arm. "David, I wasn't going to leave you. I was just scared. We can work this out." But even as she said it, they both knew it wasn't true. She had been planning to leave him. The controlling behavior, the financial deception, the constant monitoring, it had all become too much. She had been building up the courage to ask for a separation, to suggest marriage counseling, to find some way to either fix their relationship or end it safely. Now, looking up at her husband's resolved face, she realized that there might not be a safe way to end anything with David Chen. "I love you too much to let you go," David said, and those were the last words Margaret heard before the lid slammed shut with a decisive click. The latch engaged with a sound like a gunshot in the small space, and suddenly Margaret was in complete darkness. The silence was overwhelming. Margaret had never experienced darkness so complete or silence so profound. She could hear her own heartbeat, unnaturally loud in the confined space, and her breathing, which was becoming rapid and shallow as panic set in. She pushed up against the lid with both hands, but it didn't budge. The latch held firm, and the lid was too heavy for her to lift from her awkward position lying on her back. The cold was already becoming unbearable. The freezer was set to maintain a temperature of 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and Margaret was wearing only jeans and a cotton t-shirt. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, making her muscles stiff and her movements sluggish. Every breath brought freezing air into her lungs, causing a burning sensation that made her want to cough, but she tried to suppress it, instinctively understanding that she needed to conserve her energy. Margaret forced herself to think logically, to push down the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. She was a nurse. She understood hypothermia and the effects of extreme cold on the human body. She knew that she had maybe hours, not days, before the cold would kill her. But she also knew that panic would kill her faster than cold. She needed to stay calm, conserve her energy, and figure out a way to survive until someone found her. But who would look for her? David would undoubtedly tell people that she had gone somewhere, visiting family maybe, or taking a personal trip. Her next shift at the hospital wasn't until Thursday, giving David 2 full days to establish whatever story he was going to tell. Her closest friends might not expect to hear from her for several days, especially if David was responding to texts and calls on her behalf. Outside the freezer, David stood in the garage for several minutes, listening. He could hear Margaret moving around inside, the sound of packages shifting and her hands pressing against the lid. Occasionally, her voice was audible through the insulation, pleading with him to let her out, promising they could work things out. But David had made his decision weeks ago, and nothing Margaret could say would change it. He walked back into the house, poured himself a glass of the wine they'd been sharing at dinner, and sat down at the kitchen table to think through his next steps. He had researched this scenario extensively, reading about missing person investigations, about how long police typically waited before starting a search, about what kinds of stories were most believable to authorities and friends. David spent the next hour crafting text messages from Margaret's phone to her closest friends and family members. "Going on a spontaneous trip to clear my head," he wrote to Sarah. "Don't worry about me, just need some time alone." To Margaret's mother in Orlando he sent, "Taking a few days off work for a mental health break. Will call you soon." He made sure the messages sounded like Margaret's voice, using her typical emoji choices and her habit of downplaying problems to avoid worrying others. Then he went to bed, setting his alarm for his usual time, planning to go to work the next day as if nothing had changed. But as he lay there in the darkness of their bedroom, he could still hear sounds from the garage, faint scratching, occasional muffled calls for help, the sound of someone fighting for survival just 50 feet away. He turned on the television to mask the sounds and eventually fell into a restless sleep, and with one final click of the latch, Margaret Chen vanished into the darkness, beginning the most harrowing 5 days of her life. If you're still watching, drop a comment with Florida so we know who's writing this case out with us. The next morning, David Chen woke up and followed his normal routine with mechanical precision. He showered, dressed in his usual business casual attire, and ate breakfast while checking emails on his phone. To any observer, he appeared to be just another suburban husband starting another ordinary day. But when he walked through the kitchen toward the garage to get into his car, he paused and listened carefully. The sounds from the freezer had grown fainter overnight, just occasional scratching and what might have been weak attempts at calling for help. David backed his car out of the garage without looking at the freezer, though he was acutely aware of its presence in his peripheral vision. At work, His colleagues noticed nothing unusual about his demeanor. He attended meetings, reviewed claims, and participated in casual conversations about weekend plans and the upcoming football season. The only difference was that he kept his phone on his desk and checked it obsessively, waiting for someone to ask where Margaret was. But Wednesday came and went without any inquiries about Margaret's whereabouts. David's carefully crafted text messages had done their job. Margaret's friends and family believed she was taking a personal retreat and would return in a few days. Her absence from work wasn't scheduled to be noticed until her Thursday evening shift. David had bought himself time, but he wasn't entirely sure what he planned to do with it. On Thursday morning, the sounds from the garage had stopped completely. David stood outside the freezer for nearly 10 minutes, pressing his ear against the metal surface, but heard nothing. Part of him felt relief. If Margaret was gone, his problem was solved. But another part of him, a part he tried to suppress, felt something that might have been grief. He had loved Margaret, in his own twisted way. He had never wanted to hurt her. He had just wanted to keep her. Margaret's supervisor at Tampa General Hospital called David Thursday afternoon when she didn't show up for her shift. "Hi, David. This is Karen from Pediatrics. Margaret didn't come in tonight and didn't call in sick. That's not like her at all. Is everything okay?" Karen's voice carried genuine concern. Margaret had never missed a shift without notice in her 6 years at the hospital. David had prepared for this call. "Oh, I'm so sorry Karen didn't reach out herself. She's been feeling really burned out lately and decided to take a few personal days. She went to visit her sister in Georgia to decompress. I should have had her call you directly." His explanation sounded reasonable and natural, drawing on real conversations he and Margaret had had about her work stress. Karen seemed satisfied with the explanation, but asked David to have Margaret call when she was feeling up to it, just to confirm she was okay and to discuss her schedule for the following week. David assured her that Margaret would be in touch soon and hung up feeling confident that he had handled the situation well. But Margaret's best friend Sarah was less easily convinced. She had received the text about Margaret's spontaneous trip, but something about it bothered her. Margaret was a planner. She made reservations weeks in advance and always let people know her travel plans in detail. A spontaneous solo trip was completely out of character. Sarah tried calling Margaret directly, but the calls went straight to voicemail after one ring, suggesting the phone was turned off or dead. On Friday, Sarah decided to stop by the Chen house. She rang the doorbell around noon, expecting to find the house empty if Margaret was indeed out of town. Instead, David answered the door, looking surprised to see her. He was wearing casual clothes and appeared to be working from home. "Oh, hi, Sarah. I wasn't expecting anyone. What's up?" David's greeting was friendly but slightly forced, and Sarah noticed he didn't invite her in, instead standing in the partially open doorway. "I was hoping to catch Margaret before she left town," Sarah lied smoothly. "I wanted to give her a book I borrowed. Is she still here?" She peered past David into the house, looking for any sign of Margaret's presence. Her purse on the counter, her car keys by the door, her favorite coffee mug in the sink. "Oh, no, she left yesterday morning pretty early," David replied quickly. "She was excited to surprise her sister. You know how close they are." This was another calculated lie. Margaret's relationship with her sister was cordial, but not particularly close, and Sarah knew it. Sarah asked a few more casual questions about Margaret's trip, where exactly she was staying, how long she planned to be gone, whether she had driven or flown. David's answers were vague and slightly contradictory. First, he said Margaret had driven, then mentioned something about her rental car. He said she was staying with her sister, then suggested she might be staying in a hotel to have some alone time. After Sarah left, she sat in her car outside the Chen house for several minutes, trying to process what felt wrong about the interaction. David's story didn't add up, and his behavior seemed off. Margaret's car was in the garage. She could see it through the small garage door window. So how had she left for Georgia? And why would Margaret, who was always considerate about communication, suddenly become unreachable? Sarah decided to call Margaret's sister directly. After some awkward small talk, she casually mentioned that she had heard Margaret was visiting. The silence on the other end of the line was telling. "Margaret's visiting me?" the sister asked, clearly confused. "I haven't heard from Margaret in weeks. What made you think she was here?" That's when Sarah knew something was seriously wrong. She hung up the phone and immediately called the Tampa Police Department to report Margaret Chen as a missing person. The desk officer explained that adults had the right to disappear and that 48 hours wasn't unusual for someone to be out of contact, especially if they were taking a personal trip. He took Sarah's information and promised that someone would follow up within 24 hours if Margaret didn't surface. But Sarah couldn't wait 24 hours. She called 2 other mutual friends and convinced them that Margaret was in danger. The 3 women spent Friday evening driving around Tampa, checking places Margaret might go: her favorite bookstore, the yoga studio she sometimes attended, the coffee shop where she and David had first met. They found no trace of her. Meanwhile, Margaret's absence from work was becoming more complicated for David to explain. Karen had called again on Friday, this time more insistent that Margaret contact the hospital directly. Hospital policy required personal communication from employees who missed shifts, especially in critical departments like pediatrics. David assured Karen that Margaret would call over the weekend. David spent Friday night researching missing person procedures and police investigation protocols. He read about cases where spouses had successfully convinced authorities that their partners had left voluntarily, and cases where they had failed. He studied the kinds of evidence that police looked for and the questions they typically asked family members. He was preparing for interrogation, though he told himself he was just being cautious. On Saturday morning, Detective Lisa Rodriguez from the Tampa Police Department arrived at the Chen house to conduct a welfare check. Sarah's report, combined with Margaret's unexplained absence from work, had been enough to prompt an official inquiry. Rodriguez was a 15-year veteran of the force with extensive experience in domestic violence cases, and she approached the Chen house with a healthy skepticism about David's story. David invited Rodriguez in and gave her the same explanation he had been giving everyone else. Margaret was visiting family in Georgia, taking some time to decompress from work stress. But Rodriguez asked more pointed questions than Margaret's friends and co-workers had. Where exactly in Georgia was Margaret staying? What was the phone number? When had David last spoken to her directly? Could he show Rodriguez the text messages Margaret had sent about her trip? David provided Rodriguez with Margaret's sister's contact information, confident that his earlier conversation with Sarah hadn't reached Margaret's family. But when Rodriguez called the sister in front of David, the truth immediately came out. Margaret's sister confirmed that she hadn't seen or heard from Margaret in weeks and had no knowledge of any planned visit. "Mr. Chen," Rodriguez said, closing her notebook and looking directly at David, "I think we need to have a more detailed conversation about your wife's whereabouts. Her sister has no knowledge of this Georgia trip. Her best friend says the text messages don't sound like Margaret, and her employer is concerned enough to file a formal report." "Where is your wife?" David maintained his composure, but Rodriguez could see sweat forming on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "I don't understand why everyone is panicking," he said. "Margaret needed space. She's been under a lot of pressure at work and wanted to get away for a few days. Maybe she didn't want to deal with family obligations, so she told them she was going somewhere else. People do that sometimes when they need a real break." Rodriguez asked to see Margaret's belongings: her suitcase, her toiletries, her passport. David led her to their bedroom, where Margaret's suitcase was in the closet, her toothbrush was in the bathroom, and her passport was in the desk drawer where she always kept important documents. These were not the belongings of someone who had planned a multi-day trip. "Mr. Chen, I'm going to need you to come to the station for a formal interview," Rodriguez said. "And I'm going to need to search this house. We can do this with your cooperation, or we can do it with a warrant, but we're going to do it." David's carefully constructed story was beginning to collapse. But even as Rodriguez called for backup officers and a search team, even as neighbors began gathering in their driveways to watch the police cars arriving, even as local news crews started setting up their cameras, Nobody suspected that Margaret Chen was less than 50 feet away, fighting for her life in the most unimaginable circumstances. And in the garage, behind boxes of Christmas decorations and old furniture, the large chest freezer hummed quietly, maintaining its constant temperature of 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Margaret Chen had been inside for 4 days, and according to every medical expert who would later testify, she should have been dead within 12 hours. But she wasn't dead, and what she had done to survive would shock everyone who heard her story. What Margaret Chen accomplished inside that freezer defies medical explanation and challenges everything we think we know about human survival. Dr. James Patterson, a hypothermia specialist at Johns Hopkins who later studied Margaret's case, said it simply, "She should have died. By every measure we have, by every case study in medical literature, 5 days at 0 degrees should have been fatal." What she did to survive represents one of the most extraordinary examples of human determination I've ever encountered. Inside the freezer, Margaret had quickly realized that panic would kill her faster than cold. Drawing on her nursing training, she forced herself to think methodically about survival. She knew that hypothermia would slow her metabolism and reduce her oxygen needs, but she also knew that she had to maintain some core body temperature to keep her vital organs functioning. Most importantly, she knew that her situation was temporary. Someone would eventually look for her, and she just had to stay alive long enough to be found. Margaret's first priority was insulation. The freezer contained dozens of packages of frozen food, but it also contained something more valuable: plastic bags and paper wrapping that could serve as insulation. She carefully unpacked some of the frozen vegetables and used the empty bags to create layers between her body and the metal floor. She wrapped herself in the paper packaging from frozen meat, creating a crude but effective barrier against the freezer's metal walls. But Margaret's most crucial survival decision was also the most difficult one. She realized that the frozen food packages, while freezing cold, actually contained a small amount of unfrozen liquid in their centers. By holding packages against her body and waiting for her body heat to partially thaw them, she could access tiny amounts of water. It was a dangerous strategy because it meant sacrificing body heat to melt ice, but dehydration would kill her faster than the additional cold exposure. The process was excruciating. Margaret would hold a package of frozen corn or peas against her stomach or chest, using her core body temperature to create small amounts of liquid water. Then she would carefully tear open the package and drink the ice-cold water, feeling it burn her throat and stomach as it went down. Each package might provide only a few tablespoons of water, but over several days it was enough to keep her from dying of dehydration. Margaret also made a decision that probably saved her life. She chose to move as little as possible to conserve energy and body heat, but she never allowed herself to fall into a deep sleep. She had read about people freezing to death in their sleep and understood that maintaining consciousness was critical for survival. Instead, she practiced meditation techniques she had learned in a yoga class, focusing on slowing her breathing and heart rate while staying mentally alert. But perhaps most remarkably, Margaret never stopped trying to signal for help. Using a house key from her pocket, she began scratching messages into the metal walls of the freezer. The process was slow and painful. Her hands were numb with cold, and the metal was difficult to mark, but she persisted. "Help me," she scratched into one wall. "David did this," she etched into another. She included the date and her name, creating a record of what had happened to her in case her body was found later. On the 4th day, when Margaret heard voices in the garage, she mustered every ounce of strength she had left to scratch at the freezer lid with her key, making as much noise as possible. The sound was faint, but it was audible to anyone paying close attention. Unfortunately, David was careful to run power tools or play loud music whenever police were in the garage, masking any sounds Margaret might make. Outside the freezer, the police search of the Chen house had been thorough, but not exhaustive. Detective Rodriguez and her team had searched every room, every closet, and every obvious hiding place. They had found Margaret's personal belongings, confirming that she hadn't left voluntarily, but they had found no evidence of violence or struggle. The house was clean and organized, with no signs of disturbance. The garage had been searched as well, but it was cluttered with typical suburban accumulations: holiday decorations, sporting equipment, gardening supplies, and the large chest freezer that David had purchased 2 months earlier. The officers had opened the freezer briefly, seeing that it was full of frozen food and appeared to be functioning normally. The idea that someone could be alive inside a working freezer seemed so impossible that they didn't investigate further. David had been brought to the police station for questioning on Saturday afternoon, but he maintained his story about Margaret taking a spontaneous trip. Even when confronted with evidence that Margaret had never contacted her family or used her credit cards, David insisted that she was probably staying with friends and would contact everyone when she was ready. His demeanor was calm and cooperative, and without evidence of a crime, police couldn't hold him. But on Sunday morning, everything changed because of a detail so small that it almost went unnoticed. Officer Jenny Martinez was conducting a follow-up search of the Chen house, looking for anything the initial team might have missed. She was specifically searching for Margaret's cell phone, which had never been located. Martinez was checking every drawer, every shelf, and every possible hiding place when she decided to take a more detailed look at the garage freezer. Martinez opened the freezer lid and began removing packages of frozen food, looking for any hidden compartments or spaces where a cell phone might be concealed. As she worked, she noticed something odd about some of the packages. They appeared to have been opened and resealed, with small tears in the plastic wrapping that didn't look like freezer burn or normal wear. More importantly, Martinez noticed something else. Despite being in a freezer set to 0 degrees, some of the packages felt warmer than others, as if they had been repeatedly handled or exposed to additional heat, and there were scratches on the inside walls of the freezer that looked deliberate, almost like letters or words carved into the metal. Martinez called for Detective Rodriguez immediately. When Rodriguez arrived and examined the freezer more closely, she could make out partial words scratched into the walls: help, and what looked like David. The implications hit both officers simultaneously. These weren't random scratches from loading or unloading food. These were messages carved by someone inside the freezer. "We need to empty this freezer completely," Rodriguez said, her voice tight with urgency. "Right now." As they removed package after package of frozen food, the scratched messages became clearer. Someone had carved multiple words into the freezer walls, including dates, a name, and desperate pleas for help. But most importantly, as they reached the bottom of the freezer, they could hear something that made their hearts stop. It was faint, barely audible but unmistakable, the sound of shallow breathing. "Margaret? Margaret Chen? Can you hear me?" Rodriguez called into the empty freezer. The response was so weak that both officers almost missed it, a whispered help that was barely more than exhaled air. Margaret Chen was still alive, but what they found next, nobody expected. If you were in her shoes, what would you have done? Tried to escape or left a message behind? Drop your thoughts below. The discovery of Margaret Chen alive in the freezer after 5 days sent shockwaves through the Tampa Police Department and the medical community. Paramedics who responded to the scene said they initially thought they were recovering a body. Margaret's core body temperature was 84 degrees Fahrenheit, well into the fatal hypothermia range, and she was barely conscious. Her skin was pale and frostbitten, her pulse thready, her breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. And yet, she was alive. She was rushed to Tampa General Hospital, the very hospital where she had cared for so many children. Doctors immediately began the delicate process of warming her body. Too quickly, and she could suffer cardiac arrest. Too slowly, and she could slip into a coma. Against all odds, Margaret regained full consciousness after 48 hours. Her first words were weak, but unmistakable. "David did this." Investigators wasted no time. David Chen, who was already under suspicion, was arrested on charges of attempted murder, unlawful imprisonment, and obstruction of justice. When confronted with Margaret's survival, his calm facade finally cracked. Detectives later testified that David seemed more stunned than anyone in the room, muttering over and over again, "She wasn't supposed to make it." But then came the twist nobody saw coming. As forensic teams examined the freezer more carefully, they found something hidden beneath the layers of food and scratched messages. A small notebook sealed inside a Ziploc bag. Inside were detailed entries in Margaret's handwriting, written with a pen she'd kept in her scrub pocket. In it, she recorded not just her fight to survive, but evidence of David's financial fraud. She had discovered that David had been embezzling money from his clients' insurance policies, funneling thousands of dollars into offshore accounts. Margaret had planned to expose him, and David knew it. The freezer wasn't just about control or jealousy. It was about silencing the one person who knew the truth. At David Chen's trial in 2022, prosecutors presented Margaret's testimony, the notebook, and the freezer itself. Now transported into the courtroom as Exhibit A, jurors were shown the words Margaret had scratched into the metal, "Help me," and "David did this." When Margaret took the stand, her voice steady despite the trauma, the courtroom was silent. "He thought the cold would kill me," she said, "but it kept me alive long enough to tell the truth." After just 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found David Chen guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Margaret's survival became the subject of medical journals and survival studies. Experts still struggle to explain how she endured 5 days in freezing temperatures, some crediting her medical training, others her extraordinary willpower, and still others calling it nothing short of miraculous. Today, Margaret Chen speaks publicly about domestic violence, financial abuse, and survival. She has dedicated her life to helping others escape dangerous relationships before it's too late. In her own words, "I walked out of that freezer alive, but not the same. The cold almost killed me, but it also set me free." And in the end, the case of Margaret Chen left Florida and the world with one unforgettable lesson. Sometimes the human spirit is stronger than even the deepest freeze.